Hey there, it's Cooper Codes. Today we're going to be taking a look at creating an application to search through players in the League of Legends database. Riot Games has a public API we can use to search through players, so we're going to use React to make a pretty basic front end, and then we also are going to use Axios to handle the request to the API and then show data to the user. So for example, if I look up the player Cooper here, you'll see League isn't case sensitive, so it's going to find Cooper here. We can look up codes. It's going to show me the level. It's going to show me their current profile picture. And we can look up, any player and kind of find their specific data. And this is all through using requests to the League of Legends API. So we're going to look into how to handle those using Axios and making the React code flexible and usable to kind of build on top of this to make your player searches more complex and possibly show more data than just this. Let's get into it. Before we get into any development, we want to make sure that you have an API key to use. So you're going to want to go to developer.riotgames.com and then pretty much log in with your Riot Games account and make sure that under development API key, there is a string here for you to use. I'll show you guys how to use this later, but just make sure you have one. All right, so I'm going to take a moment here before we get into code to kind of explain how our entire application is going to work overall. So we have this React application that's very similar to the one I showed at the beginning of the video. It's the same concept where you have a search for player and you have a little text box to enter your player here, and then player information is going to show up down here. And we also have the League of Legends API we can contact with. So let's look at the overall flow of what's going to happen when the user enters a player name. So let's say we search for a double lift, for example. The League of Legends API has documentation to show us what requests to make. So if we want the player data for the certain name, we can say get, and it's going to be something like this. This isn't the exact API call, but this is just an idea of how it would work. And this is probably going to return an object with all the player data, such as profile picture and level, like we saw in our application. And it's going to look something like this. So it's coming in a form called JSON, which is JavaScript Object Notation. Pretty much, it's an object of data, and it has things that we can use. So as you can see here, it shows a profile picture, and it also shows a level. The profile picture is a string, which shows a certain, .png file, maybe hosted on a CDN somewhere. Then you have the level, which is just an integer. And if we wanted to show this in a way that's more easy to understand, it probably looks like this, is something you would probably expect to see as a user. We're going to take this data and then bring it over to our front end and then show that result to the user. That's kind of the process that's going on here. So just to recap that, there's kind of a three-step process in this diagram. The first one is getting data from the user search, getting that text input. Then we want to get data from the API using that text input. For example, searching for double lift. And then we want to show that result to our user. Once we're there, we're done and we're good to go. All right, let's get into coding the actual React application. First things first, you're going to want to open up a folder using Visual Studio Code or whatever text editor you're most familiar with. Then you're going to want to get a terminal and then go to that specific folder. From there, we can create our React app using npx. So we can say npx create React app and then the name of our application or the name of the folder. So I'm going to say League Search for now. Okay, so once your create React app is done, you're going to want to make sure you cd into the League Search folder that's been created with all the different React parts inside of it. You'll see we have node modules, we have public, we have source, and the source folder is where we're going to do the majority of our coding for this project. If we do npm start here, we're going to be able to see the contents of the app.js. So let's just make sure that's true. Get these side by side. You'll see we have learn React here. We have the edit source/app.js and save to reload. Subscribe to Cooper Codes. And this is just to show you that this will update in real time. And so pretty much this is showing us the live version of what our app.js is looking like. Unfortunately, we could probably get rid of a lot of the code in here. We're going to make a very simple user interface with just a text box and some text input. So first things first, we are going to pretty much delete the entire header object here, and we just want that outside div remaining. So from here, we can make a we can make a container to kind of contain our header, contain our search bar content into a little box pretty much. And you'll see we can, start by making a header here. Let's say H5 and say League of Legends player searcher. All right, so it's looking good already. Now we can go in here and create a text input. So we're going to create an input here. We're going to make sure its type is equal to text. And then we'll see what that looks like. All right, looks great to me. And then we also want to have a button, which is going to pretty much be like the submit player or search for player button. All right, so this looks great to me. Now we have pretty much text input here. And this is our very basic application so far. So you'll see app is returning this block of code pretty much. It shows we want the app to show this. We can also have different types of functionality inside of our app outside of the return statement. And why is that important, right? Well, we kind of want to create a variable that keeps track of what is inside of our input. We can use the React useState hook to keep an active variable that shows the text content of our input box. So a couple things we have to do initially to set this up is go to the top and then import. We can just say React for now, although it's not necessary. And then we can also say useState from React. So useState is going to give us two things. It's a function and you give it a parameter, and it's going to give us two things here where you say const the actual variable itself. So let's say player search, and then the function to set that variable. So set player search. That's what makes useState so interesting and powerful, is that the only way to change the value of player search, because as you can see it's a const, right? The only way to change it is to call the function set player search. So even if your React application is refreshing and refreshing, as long as it's not saying set player search, for example, or calling that function, you're fine. So a good example of using this is set player search, hello world. From here on now, player search is going to be the string hello world, right? And that's just an example of how that is going to work. If we were to say console.log player search right here, it would pretty much say hello world, or however we did that there. So that's just a simple way of understanding useState for this tutorial. If you want to get more into it, there are way more crazy things out there like React re-renders and like why it's powerful. And I would suggest take a look at the React documentation or a video specific to useState. So how do we want to use useState here is we want to have a variable. So whenever the input changes, we want the player search to pretty much show that new string. So whenever the input changes, we can use onChange here. OnChange is pretty much going to call a function. So we can take the event from the onChange, right? Since the event is coming from this input box, you can say set search text, and then this event dot target, so the input box we're currently at, and then dot value, so getting the value of this text. And that's pretty much going to help us out with having this consistent functionality working. I'm actually going to step back here and say that this should probably be called search text. I think this makes more sense. And so I'm going to say set search text instead of set player search. Something we can do that's kind of interesting is we can console.log search text. And we can go into our Google Chrome console over here and get an idea of what's actually happening in the backend here. So let's refresh this. And as you'll see, we have this thing being logged, and that's actually our search text being changed to its new value. So if you type, whatever, type your name in there if you want, type anything else, and you'll see it's getting constantly updated. And so this is really good. So if we wanted to do something like call an API with a specific name, we now have this variable that is showing the name. And so this is really great for us. So now we can get into the actual Axios part and calling the League of Legends API. Just for making this a little bit easier, we can do this, make a const API key, and then set it equal to whatever your API key is. So this is going to make our code a little bit more reasonable, so we don't have this random key popping up in different areas. It just makes it more reusable and easy to understand. We're going to have to go install Axios. So pretty much you're going to go to wherever your directory is, wherever your folder is with the React application inside of it, and you're going to say npm install Axios, so AXIOS. And this is going to install the latest version of Axios. All right, so now Axios is fully installed. If we want to actually use Axios inside of our application, we have to say import Axios from the package, which is called Axios. So now you'll see if we say Axios dot, there are going to be a lot of different functions relevant to the actually, Axios object itself is getting passed in here. So to set up our functions, what we can do is make a function called, let's say, search for player, right? And pass in the event if we want. I'll show you guys how to do that in a second. When the player presses the search for player button here, when it's on clicked, we want to use a similar syntax to the on change above, where we take the event of the click and then we pass it into the search for player and have the event there, just in case we want the event. And it's going to do a similar thing where whenever we click on this button, it is going to go and run the code of whatever is inside of this search for player function. So we can go in here and console.log hello, for example. And if we go over to a React application, make sure to npm start after you do any other npm installs or changing things. Okay, looks good to go. And let's inspect element and then go to the console here. And so we can say hello. Oh, see, it actually doesn't matter. So that's actually a good point. I can type in a name here and I'm going to press this and you'll see every single time we click it, it's going to say this hello. And so this is kind of showing whenever we click this button, we're going to have this function be called. Now, what do we want to do? We have a couple of things that need to get done in this function. First one is set up the correct API call, handle the API call, and that's pretty much it for now. So setting up the correct API call, we pretty much have to go into the actual Riot Games League of Legends documentation to kind of get an idea of how the API works. Looking at the routing values part of the League of Legends documentation, we can see that our API is going to start with this string. So let's make a variable in our code. Let's call it API call string, just to be simple. And you want to make sure it's HTTPS right here. And then after that, have this initial route. So I'm in North America, so I'm going to use that. But even if you're outside North America, I believe it's fine with you using whatever call you want. And so now we have access to kind of like the base layer of the API, but now we want to make a specific call. So if we go to this /APIs page on the developer.riotgames.com, this is where you'll see the actual routes that I'm talking about from before, and even this little GET request that I was talking about before. So a little bit of looking through the documentation, I was able to find the correct kind of GET request that we want. So we want to get a summoner by a summoner name, and that summoner name is what the user is searching for example. So if we click on this, we can kind of see all the different types of data that we're going to get returned and also how to request for it. So we can take this string, right, then add it to the end of here, to the end of our API call string. But you'll see, instead of summoner name, we're going to instead place our search text. This is what the user is searching for, and it's that variable that we were looking at before. And so this search text is going to allow us to pretty much have a specific user inside of there. And we also want to do something where we pass in the API key. So this is just something that it might be subject to change, but you pretty much have to say API_key. And this question mark pretty much says you're adding a variable to the end of your link for the Riot Games API to look at. So you're going to say API_key. That's what Riot Games decided for their API. And then you're going to add in your key to the end of your request. So as we already have it, we have an API key variable we created before, which is just this string here. So here's our entire request. It's this initial setup where we are looking up a summoner by a certain name. We're adding in that player's name that we're searching for, and then we're adding in our API key till the end. All right, so let's do an experiment. So you don't have to do Axios to make requests. It's just a way to make requests inside of your programs. But whenever you go to a website, you're making requests all the time. So we can go in and add our data here. Let's say double lift. So we're pretty much doing the same thing. We have this initial API call, then we have double lift, then we have API key is equal to, then I'm going to add in my API key here. And you'll see it's actually returning us the data that we'd expect. So you'll see double lift, he has a profile icon ID of this. Other information here. He also has a summoner level we can look at. And so this is actually giving us a block of data, and you can just do this from your regular browser. So hopefully this helps you understand what's actually happening is we're just making requests and it's giving us data. All right, so now that we understand requests from our browser, we can actually use Axios to make those same requests. So with Axios, you can say .get, and then just like you would in a browser, you're going to send in that certain string we're using. So for example, API call string here, right? And then there's a catch and a promise here. So this is like regular JavaScript promise syntax. I would say don't worry about it too much because it's kind of simple to see once it's built up. So pretty much you're going to have a success here. Then you can also catch a error if you wanted to show API errors, for example. And so we might as well catch an error just to show the entire thing overall. You'll see a good example of an error is, let's say I go over to my browser here and I, mess up my API key. Let's like delete a couple of characters. It's then going to give us an error, and so that would land in this, error section here. We can console.log the response we actually got in the success, and also console.log the error we will get if we ever get an error. So we should be able to go to our React application, inspect element here, and then move over to the console. And so let's type in a player. Let's say Vlots, and you'll see we're actually getting this status 200, which means good, API like block of text. And so this is coming from app.js at line 16. And check out where line 16 is. It's over here, console logging a response under the success. This actually has a config, it has headers, it has other things related to the response. But one of the main things we care about here is the actual data. You'll see this data shows the player name, the profile icon ID, and the summoner level, all things we care about. So if we actually do response.data instead, and let's refresh. Let's do the same player. You'll see we're actually getting just that data with the account ID, all the things we're kind of expecting here. We can kind of use this data to then show to the front-end user. To save the player data, let's just make an object to kind of save the entire object to the player data as a state. So we can say player data and set player data here. And we can say use state, and states aren't only specific to strings. You can also say an empty object, for example. And the same way we would set a string, we can say set player data response.data. This means that the player data variable is then going to be that request that we're seeing before, right? Or that data block we were seeing before. So if we get rid of this console log and we only console log player data, for example, so there actually were some issues there. When we were logging the player data right after setting it, it wasn't showing, but you'll see here when we log it outside of the function. And so when React re-renders, it's always going to call these things on the outside, like console log player data. Imagine it's running through this code. It doesn't call any functions, of course, but if anything's outside of a function, it's going to call that. You'll see the player data is then going to get changed there. So just to see this working, we can press Vlots here, search for player, and now it's going to show us right away that actual Vlots player data, which is great because that means we now have an object to then further use inside of our actual return statement here. And so we can go and then create some logic in our actual React return statement to show a possible player data block. We are going to use something called a ternary operator. Ternary operator is pretty much a way of doing an if-else statement in one line. It's a way of creating easy to understand React logic. For example, if player data is an empty object, then we don't have any data to show. So we only want to show a block of data if there is an actual new player for us to show. So how can we do that? We can pretty much say if player data itself doesn't equal an empty object. There's some strange things that happen with JavaScript and understanding if a object is actually empty or not. And you'll see if you look this up, it's kind of a common issue. One way to get around this is to do Json.Stringify, which we're going to take our object and make it into a string. And we want to make sure that object doesn't look like this empty object string. If it's anything else, that means we most likely got a successful response from the API that we can show to the user. So now let's create the full ternary operator. So the first thing we have is the question mark. The question mark is saying if this is true, so let's say this is an actual player data object, that large object is not going to be an empty object. So that's going to be true, right? So we can make a little React fragment, and let's just say for now there's a paragraph inside of there, and it's going to say true. Or like let's say, we have player data. And then you're going to have a colon here. And the colon is going to represent the false part of the if statement. And so now we can go in here and say, okay, no player data. And so this is kind of a large, line of code. So let's block this out. So we can say from here, kind of separate it out this way. So now we have our two blocks, right? We have the one with the player data and we have the block with no player data. And so let's go over here. Vlots is already saved, so it says we have player data. If we refresh, you'll see we have an empty object, so it says we have no player data. If I look up Vlots, it's going to say we have player data because now it has that object showing the Vlots data that we searched up. Now we actually want to get certain attributes out of that player data. And we look at this, we already have a console.log of what the actual data looks like. So let's make something easy. Well, we have the name of the player, so we might as well get that in there. Keep this paragraph here, but instead of that, we're going to can actually use variables, for example, like player data, and say .name. This is going to show us the name of the player. So let's just show that working. All right, showing Vlots, and you'll see if it's still going to say no player data because it's going to this part of the statement, right? All right, so now we have player data.name, and let's just also get the summoner level, right? So we can say summoner level, and then same syntax, we can say player data.summoner level. And how do I know it's summoner level? Where is that coming from? Is let's go to our localhost here, type in a player, see that console logged object. You can see it's called summoner level inside here. So you'll see we're already getting some actually accurate data. Let's look up random names and see if it shows the different levels. Okay, 232. We can look up Vlots. It's going to be 205. This is looking great. So now we want this League of Legends profile picture. You'll see they have profile icon IDs, which is kind of strange. But if you look into the actual League of Legends documentation, let's see if we can find it here, profile. So they actually use this link here to have different profile icons. And that number is going to be, you see where the 685 is? It's going to show us a certain PNG based off that number. So we can actually take this link. Let's create an image really quick with a width of 100 and a height of 100 just to make it a nice simple square. And we can set that source equal to this string. Oh, make sure it's a string that Riot has over here. And then we want to add in our specific, tag, or specific integer from the data of this object. So it's profile icon ID. So we can go in here and say plus player data dot profile icon ID. And now, oh, 1 second. I think I missed something. Oh, you gotta make sure you actually close the image object. Whoops. Okay, now the image object is closed, and we have the actual profile icon showing unique to that specific user. We can go to our web browser and then type in, whatever we want here. And let's just get an actual image ID that exists. So let's see the one over here, it's 4804. Okay, so we can go in here, say 4804. And look, this is actually doing the exact same thing where it's showing us where that PNG is living on a CDN, which is a content delivery network. It pretty much supplies you with like pictures, for example, in this example. And so that allows us to use this integer they provided to us to show actual unique profile pictures. So now we can say search double lift, for example, search, I don't know if that exists. There we go. Let's see, we already got Creeper going here. And you can kind of see we're making requests to the League of Legends API whenever we press search, and it's updating that new player data. This is pretty much the tutorial. We are pretty much going in, managing these requests to the API, and then showing unique data to the user. A really great thing about the League of Legends API is it has a lot of depth to it. There are a lot of different things you can do once you have access to all of, these variables over here, such as, the ID, the account ID, the PUUID, stuff like this. You can actually use those in other API queries to kind of show more unique data like, ranked games and other things like that. And you'll see the setup to do those calls is going to be very similar to how we do the setup for the Axios calls over here. You're going to do a GET request. You're going to, set player data or set, ranked game data, for example, and you can kind of keep moving forward working with the API. Hopefully this tutorial has been helpful in understanding how API calls work, how to handle API calls with Axios, and how to show those call results to the user. All right, have a good one.